So it looks like the US Supreme Court is about to overturn their previous ruling Roe v. Wade. For those unfamiliar with this bit of history, Roe v. Wade was a decision handed down by the US Supreme Court in the 1970s, which basically stated that people in the US have a right to get an abortion, at least under certain circumstances. The legal reasoning behind Roe v. Wade and the legal implications it had are obviously more complicated, but that's basically what it is in a nutshell. A leaked document from a court case the court is currently working on indicates that the court is likely to overturn this ruling. This decision isn't finalized by any means, and nothing has been announced yet. But if Roe is overturned, this would allow states to have the right to pass laws banning people from getting abortions. Many states already have laws that restrict access to abortion, and many have bans lined up in place ready to go should Roe be overturned. I think most people who watch my channel will understand why this is so serious. First of all, neither families nor children benefit from unwanted pregnancies and unwanted births. There's nothing ethical about forcing a child to be born into a family that doesn't want it or isn't prepared to care for it. Second of all, most laws that would seek to ban abortion in the US make exceptions for circumstances where the life of the pregnant person is in danger, but the truth is, abortion restrictions of any kind put pregnant people at much higher risk of maternal death. There are a lot of reasons why this is. These laws encourage people to seek abortions from sketchy or unsafe providers, or attempt the procedure on their own. These laws also put up red tape between a patient and the procedure if there is a medical emergency that requires an abortion. And third, it doesn't necessarily give people and doctors discretion to end a pregnancy that might become risky. They only really allow abortion in the cases of active emergencies. States that have passed laws restricting access to abortion have seen their maternal death rates rise by a whopping 40%. While the rest of the wealthy countries on this planet, and a lot of the poor countries too, are seeing a steady decrease in maternal deaths over the last few decades, maternal death in the US is actually getting worse. And a large portion of that is because of shrinking access to reproductive care and family planning services. Many of you are already in a state of panic, most likely, over this news, and I don't really need to rub it in your face anymore, but I also don't want to downplay the issue either. Of course, sometimes you get the bear, and sometimes the bear gets you. We working class people are always going to face these sort of setbacks every now and then until we rid the world of capitalism completely. But just as we face setbacks, we occasionally have victories too. In many countries around the world over the past decades, the working class has made amazing strides in the fight for reproductive rights, and there's no reason to think that something like that won't happen in the United States as well. We have not lost this fight by any stretch of the imagination. But if we are going to continue this fight, now is a good time for us to take a step back and look at the big picture. How should we understand the fight for abortion rights? Why do some segments of the ruling class want to take this right away from us? And most importantly, how do we actually fight back? Part 1. Why are abortion rights important? If you ask the liberals why abortion rights are important, you're going to get a moralistic answer. People have a right to make a choice about how they live their lives. People have a right to bodily autonomy. You can almost hear, "Do you hear the people sing?" from Les Miserables playing in the background when you hear liberals talk about this. You could put words like choice and bodily autonomy right up there next to freedom and liberty and peace and justice and other sorts of bullshit, wishy-washy catchphrases and buzzwords that seem to mean both nothing and everything at the same time.
There must be a reason for you to be here.
Yes, I'm here to fight for truth and justice in the American way.
That's what liberalism is in a nutshell. These empty phrases led bourgeois revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, including the American and French revolutions. This is the language that the nascent capitalist class used to convince thousands of peasants and workers to fight their class wars for them in exchange for only slightly more democratic rights than what they had before. And because these phrases are based on classless, immaterial morals that are supposed to apply to everyone in all circumstances, it's extremely easy for the right wing to argue against them. Sure, you should have a choice about how you live your life, but no one has the right to make any choice they want under all circumstances. Sure, you should have control over your body, but what if it isn't just your body at stake? Let's be real though, there actually is nothing abstract or immaterial about having agency over your own life and your own body. These are things that affect a person's health, safety, and quality of life in profound and very obvious ways. But liberal rhetoric attempts to strip that material reality away from these rights, believing that no one will subscribe to the argument unless they can appeal to some imaginary thing in all of us that's somehow universal and spiritual. And what kind of choice do liberals mean when they talk about freedom to choose? Well, it's often framed from the perspective of middle-class people who might abort a pregnancy. Some people, for reasons liberals don't care about and claim don't matter, might not want any kids, and some people want 1 million kids. Some people don't want to have to put their careers on hold for a baby. They want to go out and become doctors, and lawyers, and business leaders. Ugh. Abortion for liberals is, about vibes. If a baby isn't your vibe, you can get an abortion. It's about a personal preference, like whether you want chocolate or vanilla. And also, what you do with your body is also, about vibes, preference. But this doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of what abortion actually is for working class people. See, working class people often don't get any choices about how they live their lives. You work whatever job you can get at the wages the boss is willing to offer, and while you are at work, you do exactly as you are told. If you don't submit to these various forces that restrict your choices left and right, you are punished with starvation and homelessness. And when it comes to reproduction, that choice doesn't necessarily exist either, abortion rights or no. Many young people these days don't have a choice about having kids. With wages stagnating and cost of living shooting through the roof, they are forced to be childless, and they are forced to limit the size of their families if they already have children. For such people, abortion is not about choice at all. The choice has already been made for them. It's not about vibes and personal preference. It's about survival. The liberals talk about rights in abstract terms, but the majority of working class people don't have the time or energy to worry about abstract morals. For a working class person, the expense, the handicap, and the adversity of an unplanned pregnancy can be a disaster that could be very difficult, if not impossible, to recover from. Working class people should not be punished for doing something they need to do for their own survival. It might be good at this point to make a special note about the right of bodily autonomy, because I think a lot of liberals don't really understand this right either. While we often discuss bodily autonomy in the context of healthcare, especially reproductive healthcare, it is a little discussed fact that for working class people under capitalism, bodily autonomy is not really a luxury they can afford. When you are at work, your bodily autonomy is frequently violated in all sorts of ways that you probably have just convinced yourself are normal. You are told what you can wear, how you can do your hair and makeup, whether or not you can have a visible tattoo. You are forced to use your body to work in ways that may not be healthy for you or desirable to you. You may be forced to spend long stretches of time on your feet, or to work so quickly that you might injure yourself. You might be forced to work in uncomfortable or even unsafe conditions. I think of stories of fast food workers who were compelled to work in the heat of summer while the restaurant's air conditioner was out of order, when temperatures in the kitchen would get dangerously hot. I think of stories of Amazon workers who were told to work at such a fast pace that they got back injuries or were unable to go to the bathroom when they need to. I hear stories of disabled, injured, or pregnant workers whose bosses conveniently lose their doctor's notes saying that they need accommodations or modified duties. And I hear of this leading to worsening injuries or miscarriages. Talk about reproductive rights. You could tell these people, why not just get another job? But if you ever have been in a situation where you had to work one of these jobs before, you know that it never is that simple. Where is bodily autonomy for those workers? Why are liberal politicians waxing poetic about bodily autonomy in terms of reproductive rights, while the workers employed by their corporate donors are having their bodily autonomy violated on a daily basis? We also need to think about bodily autonomy in terms of environmental issues too. Where is the right of bodily autonomy for people who live in high pollution areas because it's the only place they can afford? Or for those who are forced to live in poor quality housing infested with hazards like cockroaches or lead paint? Bodily autonomy is not just a healthcare issue. It is not a culture war issue. It's an economic issue that extends much further than the scope where we usually discuss it. Another thing to consider, when we discuss reproductive rights, we often are discussing ways people might try to avoid having children. But reproductive rights also include the right to have children as well. With the high cost of living, stagnating wages, and crippling debt, the right to have children is something increasingly out of reach for more and more working-class families. It's not enough to fight for the right for abortion. We also need to fight for affordable housing, free higher education, living wages at stable union jobs, as well as universal healthcare which is free at the point of use and includes coverage for contraception, abortion, prenatal and obstetric care, pediatric care, and gender-affirming care, as well as paid parental leave for both mothers and fathers. Conservatives also do not understand what is at stake in the abortion quote-unquote debate. Many think that the pro-life movement is made up mostly of old men who for one reason or another are just cranky and have a grudge against the opposite sex. As someone who actually used to be a pro-lifer, I can tell you that that is a lie. Men and women participate in the pro-life movement equally, and women, in fact, are some of the most motivated and militant fighters of the movement too. It isn't age or gender that unites the anti-abortion crowd, it's money. Many conservatives, like your primary voting base of your mainstream liberals, are middle-class suburbanites. For a woman from a petty bourgeois or professional managerial class family, an unplanned pregnancy might be kind of uncomfortable maybe. You have to maybe quit your job, at least temporarily. You might have to be put on bed rest. You may have some health problems. But what does that matter? You have a comfortable family who can support you through all of this. You can afford to take time off to deal with the pregnancy. You can afford the medical bills. And at the end of the day, you can afford another mouth to feed. You have no idea how many middle-class quote-unquote pro-lifers I've talked to who refer to an unplanned pregnancy as an inconvenience. These women just don't want to be pregnant because it's an inconvenience. That's why they go and get abortions. When for working-class people, that inconvenience is an existential threat to your very ability to survive and make a living. And yes, I used to be a pro-lifer. I went on the marches and everything. This is when I was a college student, being raised by comfortably middle-class parents who paid for pretty much every expense I had in my life. If I had gotten pregnant at that point, yeah, it would have been an inconvenience. But when I graduated and got a job, when I learned what it was like to actually be a member of the working class, what it was like to pay your own bills, to sit in your car looking down at your paycheck that you just picked up and cry because you could pay for food this month or for your bills, but not both. You know, needless to say, after that, my politics changed real quick. I've attended both anti-abortion and pro-abortion rights rallies, and the money you see on one side of the fence versus the other is not even comparable. The pro-lifers carry professionally printed signs, and I've even seen some that have these little harnesses to hold up the sign for you, while the other team comes with the clothes on their backs and signs that they drew up themselves with things that they had available in their apartments. Of course, some working-class people do support the anti-abortion movement, but from what I observed, they are an exception, not the rule. The thing that neither liberals nor conservatives understand is that abortion rights is an existential issue for working-class people. It's not something that you can sit down and debate about on a philosophical level. I mean, I don't know necessarily whether or not abortion is quote-unquote moral or not. I don't know if a fetus has a soul. Fuck, dude. I don't even know if I have a soul. But the issue is, that's not a debate that we can have while we're living under capitalism. Because working class people often do not have a choice about whether or not they get an abortion. Which is why I kinda dislike the term pro-choice to describe the pro-abortion rights movement. For working class people, the stakes in this fight are life and death. Part 2. Why do some segments of the ruling class hate abortion rights? If you pay close attention to anti-abortion rhetoric, you notice that a lot of it centers around a strong distaste for sex. If you argue with a quote-unquote pro-lifer long enough, they will inevitably break down and declare that women who don't want to have kids should just avoid having sex. The pro-life movement isn't motivated by a desire to protect children, but to control sexual behavior, which is why they are also against birth control. This desire to control sexuality also explains their homophobia and transphobia. Of course, many rank-and-file pro-lifers do genuinely believe the rhetoric about protecting human life, but this is definitely not true for the leaders of the movement. We've established that the very well-funded anti-abortion movement is being led by the wealthier layers of society, so why would the ruling class want to control people's sexuality? To understand this, we really have to understand the modern nuclear family. While many cultures for many millennia have lived in families where married couples cared for their children together, most pre-capitalist families usually emphasized community relationships and extended multi-generational family relationships. Throughout most of human history, it actually did take a village to raise a child. The idea of a couple living alone and raising their kids as a singular unit is entirely modern. This modern nuclear family really arose with the Industrial Revolution and modern capitalism. As people moved around from town to town in search of work, this severed the bonds that they had with their communities and extended families, and it reduced the family to only the couple and their children. The modern nuclear family is an ideal form for capitalism. For wealthy families, the nuclear family is an ideal model that allows wealthy men to pass down their inheritance to their children. For working class families, the nuclear family structure makes workers particularly exploitable. When couples are cut off from extended family and community support, they have no way to provide for their needs except through proletarian labor, and they are forced into a work or starve situation. When couples are isolated, they also have to spend more money, since each nuclear family unit has to buy their own housing, their own appliances, supplies, furniture, etc., instead of being able to share those things with an extended family or community. When a man is solely responsible for feeding his wife and kids without much support, he's going to work very hard and complain very little. And when women stay home to care for that single man and their children, they do a lot of unpaid domestic labor, sometimes called reproductive labor, which supports the husband as he spends 100% of his energy working for the boss. When Margaret Thatcher said, "There is no society, only individuals and families," the reason why she adds families into that mix is because the family unit is a way of atomizing and isolating working class people, not a way of bringing them together. This isn't to say there's anything wrong with people choosing to live in a nuclear family type situation, but the problem is the ruling class doesn't want us to choose to live in that situation. They want that situation to be the only option available. The goal is to force people into nuclear family units, where they will remain as atomized as possible, but will also pump out as many children as possible, to keep the ruling class well supplied with cheap labor. They are against birth control and abortion because if sex is permanently tied to reproduction, young men and women will be forced to marry. They are also against those things because, again, the ruling class needs working class people to bear as many kids as possible in order to resupply the labor force. The reason why they oppose gay and trans rights is because they want to force gay and trans people into cis heterosexual marriages so that they can also have as many kids as possible, once again. Banning abortion and family planning also means that families cannot protect their finances by limiting the size of their families. Unexpected births throw families into poverty, which forces parents to accept lower wages, longer hours, and worse working conditions as they are desperate for any way to make a living. The ruling class is also anxious because birth rates have been dropping. Since the cost of living in America is so high, the birth rate in the US has dropped below quote-unquote replacement level. For the ruling class, this is a nightmare scenario because we will have a situation where much of the population is made up of retirees with few workers to fill the factories, and all of the workers' money will then go to supporting elderly relatives instead of into the consumer market. Or the ruling class themselves will be forced to support these retirees through taxes. A smaller labor pool also means less competition for jobs, which means that the bosses will have to raise wages. So instead of encouraging people to have kids by raising wages and improving living conditions, the more reactionary segments of the ruling class have instead chosen to take away people's option to remain childless. Poor families with many children are good for business. These reactionary political and religious leaders may not see themselves as trying to breed a cheap labor force. They may not even be thinking of it that hard and may actually believe some of their own rhetoric about protecting the widow babies. However, it is important to remember that these reactionary movements are not blindly driven by strange ideology. They're not the result of some kind of mental illness. They have material roots, and there are material reasons why the ruling class supports these movements. Of course, some segments of the ruling class at least claim to support abortion rights, specifically, once again, the liberals. After all, abortion can make workers more exploitable, since pregnant workers can't work quite as hard, and workers with children have to sacrifice work for their families. However, the liberal ruling class's commitment to abortion rights can be described as superficial at best. As we can see, the Democrats have mostly sat back and done nothing as Republicans pass more and more draconian anti-abortion laws and nominate more and more anti-abortion judges. We cannot trust liberal politicians to protect abortion rights. Part 3. What the fuck do we do now? We understand why abortion rights are important, and we understand why some segments of the ruling class want to take away those rights. But where do we go from here? What do we do about it? First of all, I think it would be helpful to discuss the things that will not work. It's pretty obvious that we cannot trust the courts. In the United States legal system, the courts giveth and the courts taketh away. They are supposed to do this according to a list of rules written up on a very old paper document where all the S's are written to look like F's. This is supposed to be an objective process. Do what the paper says. But the Constitution, like all texts, is subject to interpretation, and gee golly, wouldn't you know it, it just so happens that the correct way to interpret the Constitution at any given moment in time happens to be exactly what aligns with the political interests of the people who appointed that particular judge. I wonder why that would be. The Constitution does not give us our legal rights. Our legal rights are a social construct that exist in a social context. They are codified, enforced, and nullified by active choices made by human beings alive today. Some would argue that the Constitution is a living document, subject to modification and interpretation. I am going to argue that the Constitution is not a character in the story and never was. It's a pretext to add to an air of legitimacy for the court to do whatever it wanted to do anyway. Okay, but even if the court did do the exact job it's supposed to do on paper, even if every single decision they ever made was based on nothing other than an objective reading of this very old text, is that a good thing? We have to consider what the Constitution even is in the first place. If you need to torture yourself by listening to Hamilton again, you will recall the scene in which all the dumb rapping nerds in prissy little velvet suits get into vicious arguments about whose material interests mattered most when they were planning out the mechanics of how the government functioned. You can probably recall some of this from your own high school social studies courses too. There was a major conflict between the southern states, which were wealthy, agrarian, and built around a slave economy, and the northern states, which were poorer, but more urban and more of a proto-capitalist economy. The slave owners and the urban bourgeoisie were fighting over who would get better representation, so that the resulting government would be set up to protect their profits. You may also recall at this time that working class people, especially enslaved working class people, were not allowed to vote. Only property owners could vote. The state, at the end of the day, including the state known as the US federal government, is set up by the ruling class to handle the affairs in the collective interest of the ruling class. The Constitution was a document drafted to describe how the state was going to carry out that task of protecting the ruling class's interests. Sometimes they have to stretch the meaning of the Constitution in order to do that job effectively in the modern era, but their essential function remains the same. So when the Supreme Court bends over backwards to enforce the laws of the Constitution, what they are doing is protecting the interest of the ruling class that wrote that Constitution. And if you notice, all of this is done without any input from regular people like you and me. The framers of the Constitution lived in paranoid fear of working class people getting a taste of their own power, especially since they had just come out of a violent revolution that rode in on the backs of a very angry and very large populist movement. They specifically put measures in place to put checks and balances on democracy itself. The Supreme Court is supposed to be an anti-democratic institution. The reason judges are not elected is because the ruling class who created the Supreme Court wants people in charge who can overrule the majority will of the people, if that happens to be in the ruling class's interests. If the government, and by its extension the court, was truly a democratic institution, reproductive rights would not even be an issue of contention. 59% of Americans believe that abortion should be legal in all or most cases, and 75% believe it should be legal in at least some cases. But the only real democracy that we have in this country is democracy for the capitalists who set up the government. Many liberals will say that the problem is that we have too many conservative judges. We just have to play the same game the conservatives do, exploit all the legal loopholes in the system to fill the courts with as many liberals as possible. Then our rights will be protected. But we have clearly seen that the liberals are not really capable of beating the conservatives at their own game. And even if every single person on the Supreme Court was a liberal, that still wouldn't solve the problem. The thing is, for every Supreme Court decision that protects the rights of working class people, there are other decisions that may infringe upon those rights. All the time, the court decides in favor of bosses over workers, of reactionary lawmakers over citizens, of cops over the people they protect and serve. And if you think it's only the conservative justices who do that, you are wrong. Why are we okay with the fact that 9 random assholes in dorky little black dresses are allowed to make decisions that affect all of our rights? Why do they have the power to strike down laws passed by democratically elected officials? Why do they have the power to shape our government in such a profound way based only on what is supposedly written on a musty-ass document instead of what is in the best interest of ordinary people? The reason we cannot trust the Supreme Court to protect our reproductive rights is because it's not the court's job to protect any of our rights in the first place. The Supreme Court is an inherently anti-democratic institution that cannot exist in a just, civil, and democratic society. Of course, in order to get rid of the Supreme Court, we would have to completely replace and restructure the entire government from the bottom up, but, that is something that we could do if we wanted to do it. Countries all around the world replace their governments all the time. We've done it before, right here in America. That's the reason why we have this current government in the first place. Of course, the Supreme Court doesn't always choose the reactionary ruling in each case. After all, that's how we got Roe v. Wade in the first place. But the Roe v. Wade decision happened in the shadow of a massive, energetic, and militant movement of workers and young people. The 60s and 70s were famous for their revolutionary fury. The thing is, these positive Supreme Court rulings are not guaranteed to us, and if we want the court to do right by the people, The people first have to strike the fear of God into them. Another thing that will not protect or guarantee our reproductive rights is the Democratic Party. The leaders of the American liberal movement are responding to this Supreme Court decision by once again sounding the refrains we've heard all too many times before. Vote blue no matter who. This election will be the most important of our lifetimes. Like the Supreme Court, the Democratic Party does occasionally throw a bone to working class people. Recently in Maryland, they passed a law which guarantees the right to abortion should Roe v. Wade be overturned. Good for them. They get a gold star. But once again, these sudden moments, when the Democrats decide not to be reactionary dickwads, are not guaranteed. The United States legislature recently attempted a similar feat, a bill that was supposed to guarantee the right of abortion in the country. But despite the fact that the Democrats control both houses of Congress and the presidency, the bill floundered. I'm sure even now, while they control the entire legislative structure, they will still give us their usual bitching and moaning about how they can't do anything because the Republicans are blocking them. The Democrats have controlled this supermajority for 2 years, and only now in this time of emergency have they even offered a half-hearted attempt to codify abortion rights into law. They've had even more time for that. For decades, the conservatives have been very open about their long-term goal to take control of the courts and overturn Roe. The liberals could have spent those decades fighting back and at the very least proposing bills to codify abortion rights. And in cases where they didn't hold the majority, they still could have at least used their platforms to galvanize and invigorate the masses of working class people who look up to them to build a movement in support of such a law. But they've had absolutely no incentive to do so. The only thing the Democrats have to do to win votes is pretend that they are slightly less evil than the Republicans. They have shown over and over again that they do not care about working class people. They have nixed plans for Medicare for all. They have refused to act on climate change. They have refused to forgive student loans or end the racist, violent war on drugs, and now they are refusing to protect our reproductive rights too. They tell us to vote blue, but the problem is, we have voted blue, and all we've gotten in return is a big fat goose egg. This is because liberal politicians, like the Supreme Court, are not here to protect our rights. They are here to serve the ruling class who created the government they work for. They are there to serve the needs of their campaign donors, to guarantee the smooth and profitable functioning of capitalism. Even if they claim otherwise, they have absolutely no incentive to fight for the rights of working people. And even if the Democrats were serious about protecting reproductive rights, which they clearly are not, what exactly is their plan to protect our rights in the long term? Because it seems the only plan they have is for us to go into panic mode every couple years, mobilize en masse to vote blue, and then hope that the Republicans don't have better luck next year. Every election cycle, we are supposedly at risk of losing all of the progress we've made over the years, and I'm not satisfied with that. We shouldn't have to scramble constantly to avoid going backwards. In office, the only things the Republicans can give us are legalistic reforms that can be overturned should the other team win the next cycle. What are the liberals proposing as their endgame? It's clear that since they have no interest in revolutionary politics, they don't have an endgame. They are perfectly comfortable with the balance of power as it is. They are perfectly comfortable with a status quo in which the working class gains small victories after only enormous struggle, which can be taken away with the snap of a finger. We do not owe the Democrats our support. They are not representatives of the working class. If we want to make any political progress in the long term, it is absolutely essential we disavow the liberal servants of capital and build independent working class political movements and parties. If we play the game of lesser evilism, over time it doesn't give us less evil. It only further and further lowers the bar. Vote for Democrats if you want, or don't, but understand that politics doesn't happen in the ballot box. It happens on the streets. When politicians do the right thing, it's not because they were elected to do so. It's because the working class has, once again, struck the fear of God into them with massive movements. And if you look back across history, even the most reactionary politicians suddenly start acting real progressive when we pose a credible threat to the ruling class's power. The judges didn't give us Roe versus Wade because they decided out of the goodness of their hearts to grant working class Americans the right to medical privacy. It happened because outside the courthouse there was this massive militant organized movement of working class and young people demanding the rights for women and other marginalized groups. And some of the most important women's rights legislation ever implemented in the United States was signed by none other than Richard Nixon, one of the nastiest reactionaries to ever walk the face of the earth. Imagine that. A conservative politician gave us Title IX, which prohibits sex discrimination in schools. That same conservative also passed landmark environmental protection too, all because working class people were out on the streets and on the picket lines in massive numbers. If we want to protect and expand reproductive rights, waiting for the court to protect us and campaigning for candidates in bourgeois political parties is not going to work. The only thing that will work is to build a large, militant, highly organized, grassroots movement based in mass participation of working class people. This is not an easy task to do, but it is an essential one. The first step in doing this is, of course, building up socialist organizations which are funded by membership dues, which take no corporate donations, and whose leadership is strictly accountable to the rank and file. Unfortunately, at this point in history, the working class is weak. That's why the government is able to get away with things like overturning Roe v. Wade. And until we build back our power, we will have to suffer more defeats of this nature. But even with all of that, we still have every reason to be optimistic. Working class people are mobilizing more and more in this era. Companies we thought could never be unionized are suddenly facing massive, often successful union drives, such as the ones that we're seeing at Amazon and Starbucks. Workers who are already unionized are engaging in waves of strikes. While this doesn't directly affect reproductive rights, we can't fight for any of our rights unless labor is first organized and militant. Street protests are all well and good, but only workers hold the economy in their hands. Only workers have the power to truly threaten the ruling class's ability to make a profit, and only workers can actually carry out a revolution. Any successful campaign to protect and expand reproductive rights will require mass participation of organized labor. Strikes, slowdowns, and walkouts and workplace disruptions are the most powerful tool we have for political change. Losing Roe versus Wade is no small defeat. Let's not sugarcoat things. But we, the working class, are going in the right direction, and a long string of victories is ahead of us. However, these victories will not simply be handed to us by judges or by politicians from capitalist political parties. We are going to have to fight for them, and we're going to have to fight hard and fight dirty. And if we want any hope of securing our rights in the long term, we have to completely and totally remove the ruling class from power altogether. Reproductive choice is not truly possible under capitalism. As long as people have to pay to access healthcare, the poorest of the poor will not be able to get contraception, abortion, or other family planning services, and those who want children may not be able to afford to have them. As long as our workplaces are run purely for the boss's profits and not in the interest of workers, workers will constantly be forced to choose between their work and their families. As long as the basic necessities of life are not guaranteed to us, working class families will not truly be able to make their own choices about what type of family they want to have, because the economy will be making that choice for them. This is why we have to fight for an anti-capitalist future, not just a feminist one. Only when working class people control both the economy and the government democratically will we be truly able to control our own lives. In a future video, we will discuss in more detail how we go about the work of building these movements. In the meantime, if you are anxious to get involved, I highly encourage you to reach out to a local chapter of a socialist organization and learn more about how you can participate in their work. You can also message me on Facebook or shoot me an email, and I can tell you about my own political work and help you get in touch with some comrades in your area. This is a fight we can win, but we the working class will only win if we fight it on our own terms. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this video, or at least thought it had something interesting to say, there are many ways that you can support my channel. You can like this video and comment below to drive up engagement. It would also be a huge help if you could share the video on social media to anyone you think might be interested. You can subscribe to the channel so you can see future videos I have coming down the pipe. You can also support my channel on Patreon. Socialist media is beholden to the people who fund it. And socialist media can only stay socialist if it gets its funding from regular working class people like you. I don't collect any money from advertising or sponsorship on this channel. Right now, I pay for all the expenses out of my own pocket. With support from Patreon, I could afford to buy better software and recording equipment to increase the quality of my videos. The money will also go toward basic living expenses, which will allow me to spend fewer hours working at my day job and more time on videos. Any amount you can give is appreciated, and no donation is too small. Thank you for your support.